Welcome to our Animal Justice Academy Lunchtime Live. I'm Kimberly Carroll. I am the director of AJA. And our topic today, it's a juicy one. What the studies say about animal versus plant-based meat. I want to welcome all you beautiful folks here with us live. Welcome to those of you who are watching the replay. We have Dr. Matthew Nagra here joining us today. And just to give you a little context, folks, I just want you to remember, just a few short years ago, we had Beyond Burger, Impossible Meats just sort of roar onto the scene, lots of fanfare, people were super excited. Fast forward, to today, where we're getting pushback about, how these plant-based meats are ultra processed and unhealthy. Matthew is here to talk about what's happened and share the review he did around comparing the health of plant-based meats versus animal meats. So Matthew, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's
It's
wonderful to
exciting to
have
have
you.
so many people in here. And I'm a little bit
Yay.
colder just reading the comments. I feel like everyone's in like crazy cold temperatures. I'm like cold in Vancouver right now and it's barely zero. Not
Oh
even.
man, yeah, it's pretty brutal here. But and even for Vancouver, that's cold. Like Vancouver doesn't drop very almost never goes below zero. And you've hit below zero many times this winter, haven't you?
Yeah, a few. And we had our first snowfall just last week or 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
But only a couple days and then and then it clears up. So it's not like you guys.
Yeah, oh, good. Well, Matthew, I want to give just people a little bit of background on you. So just bear with me here. So Matthew is a naturopathic doctor, and he's devoted to bringing the most up-to-date and evidence-based nutrition information to his patients in his Vancouver-based practice and to the public. Many of you have probably follow Matthew on his social media, does public presentations, very focused on correcting nutrition misinformation so that folks can make informed choices about their health. In 2018, Matthew graduated from the Boucher. Do you say Boucher? Boucher, Matthew?
Boucher. Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Boucher
Yeah, you got
Institute
it.
after completing his bachelor's of science in microbiology and at the University of Victoria. Matthew's also been a contributing author on multiple textbooks from the professional health systems, including their nutrition textbook. I was a scientific reviewer for the best-selling book, The Proof is in the Plants by Simon Hill. Amazing. And has had his work featured in leading media outlets, including Men's Health and the New York Times. Amazing, Matthew. You are a superstar for the plant-based movement. Okay, so Matthew, you led a review that was recently published in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology called Animal versus Plant-Based Meat, a Hearty Debate. Can you, first of all, tell us what a review is exactly and what originally inspired you to take on this project?
Yeah, so I mean, there are different types of reviews. This one in particular was a narrative review. So we essentially were just reviewing the data on that topic of obviously plant-based meats versus animal-based meats. But with the narrative review, there's a little more flexibility in sort of how you approach it. Then there are systematic reviews where there's a very specific sort of protocol to like how you search for articles and how you weed out certain articles or include others. We didn't necessarily follow that protocol, but honestly, it was pretty close. The reason we didn't is because this review actually didn't start that way. What
Mm.
happened was we were looking at maybe doing a trial, like actually conducting a study on plant-based meats. And the doctor at the University of British Columbia that I was working with, he was like, well, if we're going to apply for, say, funding for a study, we'll probably want a bit of a literature review to, showcase and be like, this is where the evidence is, this is what we need to look at, and kind of show what um, how our study would be useful.
Mm,
And so
mm.
I just kind of took it upon myself to write up a review. And I handed it over, and he's like, "Man, this is really good. We should look at maybe cleaning it up a little bit and trying to actually publish it." And that's really how it started. And then kind of went back and went through a bit more of a rigorous process as far as the the literature searches and the writing, editing, etc. But that's really how it started, and that's why it ended up being more of a narrative review. But I would say, at least at the time of publication, and there's one more systematic review and meta-analysis that's been published since. But at the time of publication, I would say might be the most comprehensive on the topic at that point. Yeah, so that's really what happened. It was sort of just a happy accident almost, at least how it
Mm.
started.
Well, and I mean, it's not like you're a bit of a busy guy. So I imagine you did this because this is this is a passion for you. This is something you felt was really needed out there. So can you just kind of take us through the journey of what happened between like about 5 years ago when Beyond Burger Impossible Meat was like, "Ah!" It came onto the market, and everybody was so happy to have this uh, plant-based meat that had a really similar flavor profile and texture, to today with plant-based meats getting such a bad rap. Can you take us through this journey?
Yeah, I mean, it exploded back in, I want to say roughly 2018, 2019, something like that, around that time. And also 2019 when the Game Changers came out, that probably helped to a degree. And and it was doing really well for a couple years there, and then it started to get a lot of pushback, and especially from more of the sort of animal-based circles, from meat industry. And more recently, there was actually a really good article published in Fortune Well, I think it was called, where they interviewed Ethan Brown, the CEO of Beyond Meat, and he talks about this sort of like organized smear campaign against Beyond Meat products. And that's where a lot of the messaging of like it's ultra processed, look at all the ingredients, that sort of messaging came about and really pushed people away from these plant-based alternatives. Now, they tend to focus on specifically Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods because they are the most popular. But this is extended to other products as well. And I'll actually link the article here in the chat
Yeah,
for anyone who wants it. It's right there.
thank you.
Really, really good read, I would say, for anybody who wants to kind of look at that campaign and some of the info about like how they discovered that this was taking place. And one thing that Ethan Brown, if I recall, he says in that article that was shocking to him was that this smear campaign, it worked. Like that's the thing. It's at first you might have thought, well, yeah, it'll pass. It's not gonna last. It's not gonna hurt us too much. And no, it actually ended up working and really creating this fear around these products.
Yeah, just ask soy.
Yeah.
Like it really is. It sounds much the way the industry went about assassinating soy about what, say, 15 years ago. This is a pattern that the animal ag industry is famous for. As soon as there's plant-based, alternatives that are threatening, especially, saying, products that are healthier, more environmental, they've got big money behind them, right? So you see this quite a bit, I'm sure, Matthew, you've seen this a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. But what's also funny is, on the other hand, a lot of the meat companies have actually bought up some of the plant-based meat companies too. So it's kind of like it's both sides of
Exactly.
the coin. It's like they know that they need to um,
Yeah.
sort of invest in the alternative protein space, but at the same time, then you have others kind of smearing the products. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of funny that way.
Well, and so somebody, yeah, SK says, how do we smear back? And that's a question. Like, how do we hit back?
I mean, I think a big part of it is education, and it's unfortunate. I find that we have very sort of a short-term memory when it comes to this kind of stuff. Like if you look at, again, we'll go back to the Game Changers, exploded. If you look at Google Trends on like vegan or plant-based, it spikes like crazy around when that film comes out, and then it slowly declines, and then whatever new comes out, carnivore or whatever, that takes off and then eventually declines. So I feel like we need that repeated exposure over and over and over again. And
Mhm.
so we have, I think, some really exciting things coming from the like plant-based meat space later this year. And I was told that some of, I can't say too much about it at this point, but there were things that were going to come out, I think, very, very soon,
Ooh.
that should be I think, beneficial for that space. But then you have like new films, you have media campaigns. There was recently a big social media push around plant-based meats that got a lot of traction. I participated in that too. I think we just need that repeated exposure. And then I think there's different ways to hit back on a lot of these arguments. Like there is, of course, the ethical side, there's the environmental side. You could just talk about health benefits of plant-based meats, like obviously we did with our paper. But then I also take the approach of often pointing out like sort of hypocrisy in a lot of the more animal-based um, talking points, and so I find that works really well for a lot of the public, where um, someone might not really understand what or how important saturated fats effect on LDL cholesterol is, or something like that. But they will understand that, hey, that's hypocritical, or like that's it's just really easy to grasp. And so I do that with a lot of my social media, and you'll notice that I'll have like a clip of somebody, and this doesn't have to be plant-based meats, but a clip of somebody saying something, and then I'll point out how um, if you apply their logic to things they promote, it also suggests that they're promoting harm, so to speak, or whatever. So I find that really works super well.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, being armed with, your talking points, your way of poking holes in the misinformation campaign, and a huge way is having reviews, studies, like the one you have. So, can you tell us, what does the review that you did show about the healthiness of plant-based versus animal meats? Give us the lowdown.
Yeah, so we looked at a few different things. We looked at one, like what are the main components of plant-based meats? Obviously, they vary depending on the product, but we found that as far as protein sources, the most common were soy protein, pea protein, mycoprotein, which is sort of like mushroom protein, not exact, but similar sort of family, and then vital wheat gluten, which is the main ingredient in seitan, for those who are familiar. And there's limited evidence on the mycoprotein so far, but we have some research on pea protein, or more specifically pea intake. We have lots of evidence on soy protein, and very limited on the vital wheat gluten. But from what we do have on all of these, again, especially the soy protein, we see that they improve cardiovascular risk factors. We know that consumption of things like soy and peas are beneficial as well. Now, on the fat side, there's three main types of fats. There's the coconut oil, which is higher in saturated fat and probably not the healthiest source of the ones that we can choose from. There's olive oil, which is quite healthy, rich in monounsaturated fats. And then we just lump them together, vegetable oils, things like canola, sunflower, etc., that are rich in the polyunsaturated fats. And so the latter two, the liquid oils, those are the more heart healthy ones. So that was sort of one part of what we looked at. Now, the second part is what are the actual nutritional profiles? And we didn't go into the nitty gritty of micronutrient contents like individual vitamins and minerals, really. We focused more on the nutrients that impact heart health. So saturated fat, fiber, cholesterol, the different types of unsaturated fats. And we found that compared to meat, almost across the board, plant-based meats had less saturated fat. They always had less cholesterol because only animal foods contain cholesterol.
I
They
think that's an
had a little bit,
important, I just want to
yeah.
stop you. I think that's an important talking point every plant-based advocate needs to remember, that plant foods don't have saturated fat. So thank you.
Or sorry, they can have saturated fat. They don't have cholesterol,
Oh, yeah,
but
cholesterol.
they tend to have less saturated fat.
That's right. That's right. And only very specific, sort of like only coconut is the only whole food, right, that has saturated fat. Is that right? Or is there
No,
more?
so all foods, or
Mhm.
all foods that contain some fat, will have some
A
saturated
little bit of
fat, but
saturated
the
fat.
amounts are generally very low
Got it.
in a lot of the other foods. But like
Okay.
coconut is richer in saturated fat.
Okay. Got it. Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. So no
Um,
cholesterol. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Got
less saturated fat, no cholesterol. They had more fiber. Now the fiber content varied. Like sometimes it's a gram or two, which isn't super meaningful. Sometimes it's 4, 5, 6 grams. And so it varies.
it.
Um, and then they had a bit more carbohydrates. Now part of that being due to fiber, but even when it came to other carbohydrates, whether that's sugars or starches, pretty minimal across the board. So like a few grams here and there. And then not all the studies looked at this, but some studies reported less calories per serving, less monounsaturated fats, but more of the polyunsaturated fats, which are very heart healthy. And then the protein content and sodium content varied significantly. So some products would be high in sodium, some relatively low, some would be higher in protein than the animal-based food, and some would be lower. So that's sort of where choosing products, there's a little bit of attention that can be paid there. Now, I think the most important part of of our review was looking at the actual clinical trials that compared meat to plant-based meats. And so these were trials like the famous swap meat trial, where they used Beyond Meat products and compared them to grass-fed organic meat products and had people consume 2 or more servings per day for 8 weeks and then flip to the opposite diet. They weren't all using those products, but we looked at 6 trials doing that sort of comparison. And we saw across the board lower cholesterol levels, lower LDL cholesterol levels, which is a more accurate predictor of cardiovascular risk. No significant difference in blood pressure, interestingly. And then also some improvements, although there were only a couple trials in body weight and waist circumference. So a little bit of weight loss as well with the plant-based products. Now, why the blood pressure part is interesting because, like I said, some products are super high in sodium, and sodium or salt is known to raise blood pressure. But the speculation there, at least the main speculation, is that these plant-based meats like Beyond Meat, Impossible, whatever, they come pre-seasoned, right? So they're already flavored. You're not necessarily adding a lot of salt to them when you're cooking them. Whereas if you get a plain old slab of meat, you're probably adding salt to it as a part of the flavoring or whatever seasonings. And so you end up actually consuming roughly the same amount. And so that's probably why we don't see significant changes in blood pressure, at least one of the main reasons. So that's really at a high level sort of what our review found overall. And it points towards, on average, these plant-based meats being a healthier option. But of course, there is variability. Some products are healthier than others.
Yeah. So wow. And can you like, just to be clear, when we're talking about plant-based meats, we aren't talking about just tofu and tempeh. We're talking about these packaged, prepackaged meats, right? Like these more convenient meats. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so we actually specifically in our review we excluded studies looking at like tofu and that sort of thing. We did include one study where they used TVP, so those are like soy chunks or whatever, which again because they're more meant to mimic meat, and they're a little more heavily processed. But we didn't include any like tempeh or tofu or certainly any like whole food sources.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we're comparing apples to apples here, as
Yeah,
opposed to, we're not saying, oh yeah, it's, the, of course soy is more healthy than meat.
yeah.
We're saying, like, this burger that you are villainizing on this grill that's plant-based and it tastes like the meat one, is actually healthier overall. So
Yeah.
that's just so people understand, because obviously a whole food plant-based diet has been proven over and over again to be one of the healthiest out there. So, okay, can we talk about this ultra processed obsession? um,
Yep.
is this ultra processed thing, is it fully merited? Like, there's such an obsession, and should there be?
So there's huge debate in the scientific community right now, the nutrition community, around the labeling of foods as ultra processed. And this is because, and you might be surprised to hear this, whether or not a food is labeled as ultra processed has zero bearing on whether or not it's healthy. Like when classifying foods, you do not look at health outcomes. It has no relevance. It's more so about the like number of ingredients. Are they like industrially produced ingredients? It's looking more at like how they're made and what they're made from. So to illustrate, let's look at, I'm just going to list a bunch of foods that are all classified as ultra processed. You have sodas, you have sausages, you have whole wheat bread, whole grain cereals, you have donuts. I think anyone can sort of understand that those are all very different, and we should expect that they would affect our health very differently. And so what we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years is studies that, like, if you look at ultra processed foods as a whole, you see that higher ultra processed food intake is associated with worse outcomes, higher diabetes risk, higher cardiovascular risk. But when you actually break it down into individual like subcategories, so you maybe lump the whole grain breads and whole grain cereals together, you maybe lump the processed meats together, you have the sodas together, you see that it's mostly the sodas and the processed meats that drive the risk. Those are the ones that are really bad for us. And then things like whole grain breads actually lower our risks of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and maybe even certain cancers. And so those are, so we need to find out, like, on that spectrum, where do the plant-based meats lie? Because we can't just assume that they're going to be bad for us, like the processed meats. But we also can't just assume that they would be really good for us, like the whole grain breads. We have to actually conduct that research to see it, and they tend to be closer to, I'd say, those whole grain products, maybe a little closer to central than that on that
Mhm,
spectrum,
mhm.
but certainly not on this, super harmful side.
So that's so good to know, Matthew, because I think one really great talking point for people that are getting pushback about the ultra processed label is like whole grain bread is also ultra processed. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean it's not an indication of health. It's just a classification of ingredients, of amount
Yeah,
of
or
ingredients.
I mean, if you really, it depends. I'll do this sometimes if I really want to sort of be quippy about it. I'll just ask like, well, can you define an ultra processed food? And most people can't. They don't know
Right.
what it means at all. So it's based on like the NOVA classification, and there's like specific criteria for what is considered unprocessed or minimally processed, processed, a culinary ingredient, or ultra processed, and they have specific
Yeah.
sort of labeling for each. But like obviously that's a little too technical, but it's always kind of just a funny one to throw out there because people throw around the
Mhm.
term a lot. They'll just say stuff
Exactly.
as ultra processed or heavily processed without really knowing what that means.
Yeah, and there's that meme that has been going around for years with Beyond Meat, Beyond Burger, and all these ingredients, and
Yeah.
then the meat burger, and it just says beef. And it's so people are just assume that because there's multiple ingredients that it's bad, and
Mhm.
that isn't the case. Like, so
Yeah.
can you name a few other products that are considered ultra processed, like whole wheat bread, that are actually healthy?
So I mean, there are certain products that would be like fruit based potentially. I'm trying to think of the exact. I mean, I can't think of like brand names or whatever they would be.
Mhm.
But like it's usually, if we're to classify the different groups, it's usually the whole grain based products, and it doesn't have to
Mhm.
be bread, it doesn't have to be cereals, but generally
Right.
the whole grain based products that do the best. There's now what's interesting is most of the ultra processed food categories, if you go down the
Mhm.
list, end up being relatively neutral. So a lot of
Interesting.
them are just kind of middle of the road, not super
Mhm.
bad for you, not super good for you, just kind of in the middle. But then again, on the far side of the what's not good for you are going to be the sugary sodas and the processed meats. But also what you need to consider is what are you comparing these foods to? So that's why in our review we only included studies where plant-based meats were compared to animal-based meat. We didn't want to do studies where you're comparing like I don't know, plant-based meats to whole grains or legumes or something, because that's a
Mhm.
different that's an interesting thing to look at, but
Yeah.
it's not relevant to the discussion of should we be eating meat or plant-based meats, and so we wanted to hone in on that.
Well, and I think a lot of people, are sort of a lot of people that eat plant-based are asking, well, how often can we safely eat these plant-based meats? And so yeah, like I don't think we're saying you should be eating them all the time, but can you give us a little bit of a better sense, what you would say is a healthy amount?
Yeah, so I would say it depends on the product. So if you have products that are relatively low in saturated fat, like let's say a few grams per serving or less, that are relatively low in sodium, we'll say 300 milligrams or less. Honestly, even at a daily consumption, I don't see an issue with that in most contexts. However, most products aren't like that. Like there are a select few that are. If you're looking at products that have, 600, 700 milligrams of sodium and maybe 6, 7, 8 grams of saturated fat per serving, um, I might limit that to, once or twice a week tops. But
Mhm.
that also depends on your biomarkers. If your blood pressure is in check, if your cholesterol levels are quite low, you can probably get away with having that more often. So it's not something that I can just prescribe broadly and be like, this is how many times you can have it. It would depend on where your risk factors are at to begin with.
Mhm.
Like I'm just speaking personally, my ApoB or LDL cholesterol is very low. I have leeway to eat more saturated fat if I wanted to. Not that I do
Mhm.
that, but that's probably part of the reason why the numbers are so low. But if I wanted to, I might have more leeway than somebody who comes in with an LDL cholesterol of 3 or something, where they're kind of on the upper end of the normal range, and if they bump it up by even 10%, they might end up kind of skirting the high cholesterol range. So
Yeah.
that's sort of it's hard to give just a general answer.
No, it's just really good to know, and it's good to know, I mean, I think it's important for people to just hear it again that, a whole food plant-based diet is the ideal health-wise. And these products they're here to, be able to give us some of that comfort food taste, the tastes of foods that we might have grown up with, or that we can go to a barbecue and have the same thing. And so yeah, that's a really good marker to be able to look at the saturated fat and the sodium. And I think that sodium comes up a lot. And something that people around plant-based meats get worried about. And I think it's important to address, specifically in your review, that even the high sodium didn't negate the cardiovascular benefit. Am I right on that?
Yeah, so we saw no harm as far as like raising blood pressure. In fact, I'm not familiar, even there's been a couple studies since our review. I'm not sure that a single one ever has. It doesn't look like any study has shown that they raise blood pressure, but at the same time, they don't seem to lower blood pressure. It's just pretty
Right.
neutral.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, something like beans or nuts, they tend to be even beneficial for blood pressure. So if you were to compare plant-based meats to those foods, maybe the plant-based meats are a little worse for blood pressure. It's totally
Okay.
possible.
Hmm.
But again, compared to meat, there is no detriment for blood pressure, and then there's benefits in other markers. So yeah, that's kind of where they sit. Again, it's all a spectrum.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think it's also an important piece. This is something that I've just sort of learned from, you wonderful health practitioners, that fiber is the answer right now. Like, everybody's sort of focused on protein, but having higher fiber in our diet is really what most of us in North America have to pay more attention to. Is that correct? Am I on the right?
Yeah, what's the latest? I'm trying to think of the latest stats. I might be wrong on these numbers, so don't quote me
Mhm.
directly. I think it's around like 30% of Americans that even meet the minimum fiber recommendations. It's
Wow.
not, regardless, it's not good,
It's
even if that
low.
number is a
It's
bit off.
low. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's off. But with with these plant-based meats, yes, they provide some fiber. I wouldn't rely on them as a major fiber source. Like even the ones that contain fiber, it's usually a few grams or so. Sometimes, I've seen products that go up to even like 5 or 6 grams, which is actually reasonable. But a lot of the
Mhm.
products, it's like 2 or 3 grams.
Mhm.
It's not a ton. But it's still more than the meat, which has zero. So
Yeah.
there's at least some in there.
Yeah. It offsets some of the things that
Yeah,
might have been a little bit more harmful had there not been the
yeah.
fiber there. Okay, so now we need to talk about, what do we do with this information? Okay. And I was gonna actually, Matt is asking it perfectly. If you're at a barbecue and someone says Beyond or Impossible burgers are less healthy than beef burgers, what would you say back? What are a couple of talking points that, or 3, 4, 5 talking points, whatever it is, that you want us to remember when that comes up?
Okay. So for starters, usually if someone says something like that to me, I'd say based on what evidence? Because like I think where we get lost in a lot of these sort of debates is that someone makes a claim and then we feel
Mhm.
like we have to defend our position when really they're the one making the claim. They should be the one defending their position. So like
Mhm.
now that's like my debate brain going off because I do participate in some like online debates and stuff.
Right.
So like I would just like based on what evidence and then they just crumble. They have nothing. But that aside, like let's say you want to actually engage with the comment and make some or reply in some way, I would say, well, plant-based meats, they don't have cholesterol, they tend to have less saturated fat. So that's two right there. They have similar amounts of protein typically as the animal-based meats. They're better for the environment. Um, and research has shown that they improve our cardiovascular risk factors. And you can mention specifically they lower cholesterol, they might promote weight loss. Like there's specific ones from our review in particular that you can cite. But yeah, I would say less saturated fat, no cholesterol. I mean, they provide some fiber. You can say better for the environment, similar protein. Um, like these are all good. But at the end of the day, honestly, just based on what evidence is the funniest way to reply. Just because they
Mhm.
never are able to cite anything, or they pretend they can, but then won't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, what if they come back and say, well, they're so processed? What are your what are your little
Yeah.
back pocket, responses to that?
Well, so I would cater it to the individual, but like normally, I would just say, again, what does that mean? Because they usually don't know. But that again, that aside, see, this is the thing. I ask people to clarify what they're saying.
I love
That's
that.
how I
I love that
respond most
technique.
of the time,
Yeah.
because once you get people to unpack what they're trying to say, they realize
Mhm.
very quickly that they have no idea what they're saying. Um,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
uh, but that aside, if someone says it's heavily processed and like if I know this person consumes like whey protein, for example, or protein powder, I'm like, that's ultra processed. Why are you consuming that? Right. Then it's a double standard. That's what I'm
Mm.
getting back to what I talked about earlier. When there's hypocrisy or double standards, you can point out, well, if ultra processed foods are bad and you have this protein shake every day, why are you having bad food every day? Like, and then they have to do the
Mhm.
mental gymnastics of like figuring that out.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you could always bring it back to, but plant-based meats improve cholesterol levels, might promote weight loss, don't have any negative effects on blood pressure or other markers. What's the problem?
Yeah.
Like that's
Absolutely.
ultimately what it comes down to.
Yeah, and can you do the flip side? And if we were to say blah 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 blah, and just so you know, this beef burger that you're about to eat, what would you tell them about that?
Yeah, and well, I mean that's compared to the beef burger anyway. But
Mhm.
I would say, daily beef consumption is associated with higher risks of colorectal cancer, of cardiovascular disease, um, potentially type 2 diabetes. Like
Mhm.
you can just list off the things that the red meat is associated with as far
Yeah,
as worse outcomes.
and it's actually considered a carcinogenic. You know?
Yeah, probable carcinogen for
Yeah,
at
yeah,
least colorectal
carcinogen.
cancer.
Yeah, it's like there we go. Yeah, so I love that. Thank you so much for giving us like the shorthand of how to be able to ward off the attacks. And also, Matthew, your review isn't the only one out there right now that is saying the same thing. Can you tell us there's just a new study out of the UK? Can you tell us just a little bit about it?
Yeah, so there was a unlike our review, there was actually a primary study done out of the UK where they actually looked at individual products and quantified the nutritional content, the saturated fat content, and so on. And they found, similar to how we concluded, that these plant-based meats generally had less saturated fat, obviously no cholesterol. They found actually similar protein content. Now, you might be able to remind me here because I can't recall, but I think they found that certain types of plant-based meats had more protein and others had less. Like I think it was like seitan-based products or gluten-based products had more protein than meat or something like that.
Yeah.
But basically they concluded similar to what we did. And this is just more data to add to the pile that we currently have.
Excellent. Thank you. Debbie's saying Beyond reformulated to replace coconut oil with avocado
Yeah.
oil and is now certified by the American Heart and Diabetes Association. So I was going to ask you, how have plant-based meat companies shifted in response to the assassination campaign in both the ways they formulate the products and the way they promote them?
Yeah, I think it was an awesome job. I've had a chance. I know they aren't in Canada yet. I think they will hopefully be coming. But I did try them. They actually sent me a couple, full disclosure, not that I'm paid by them or anything. But they sent me some samples to try, and then I had some when I was down in the States as well. And I think they taste the same. Like they're excellent. And I think one of the undervalued components of the plant-based meats or even processed foods in general is that we can reformulate them. Like you can tweak them. You can't just like reformulate a cow, but you can do this
Mhm.
with, at least not overnight. But you can do this with these plant-based products. And so yeah, they got rid of the coconut oil and I mean they had a bit of canola in there as well. They got rid of those and replaced that with just avocado oil. So the saturated fat content I think is down to 2 grams or something now. And then the
Mhm.
sodium content is around 310, I believe now, down from originally, I think it was like 600, and then they cut it down to 400 something, and now it's even lower. And so this is a product that honestly, with regular consumption, I wouldn't even really see an issue with, because
Mhm.
it's very high in protein, so they up the protein content a little bit, and then they lowered the saturated fat and sodium to levels that are quite reasonable, and they still taste really good. Um,
Mhm.
And if we see more products sort of make that switch, I think the health arguments become even harder against these products. Not that there's much of an argument now, but as far as what they try to say, I think it becomes more and more difficult. And so if there's anything positive that came out of this whole smear campaign, it was that it sort of forced these companies to rethink their products and maybe figure out ways to get around, the sort of processing arguments or the I don't know, sodium arguments or whatever they happen to be.
Mm, excellent. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up to some community questions. We already have quite a few questions. And I'm just going to invite anybody else putting further questions in just to put star Q just so that we can differentiate your questions from just the regular chat. So Gail is asking, did any research include plant-based dairy? Now that's a a little bit of a different ball game. But Matthew, any sort of sources for people who want to sort of be able to defend non-dairy milks?
Yeah, so not in these studies that we looked at, right? Because we were very specific about the plant-based meat versus the animal-based meat. But there is research on plant-based milks. Now, nutritionally, when you take like a fortified, so fortified meaning they add extra calcium, they might add vitamin D or other nutrients to like a soy milk. Um, it's very comparable to dairy milk. And when you look at trials comparing soy milk to even skim milk for LDL cholesterol levels, the soy milk comes out on top. So I would say of them, the soy milk is probably healthier than any form of dairy milk.
Mhm.
That said, if you were to choose products like oat milk or almond milk, if they're fortified, you obviously still get calcium or other nutrients in there, but the protein content is really low, and so that's something that I do think we need to be cautious of if we're not getting a lot of protein through other foods. So you're not consuming things like tofu or tempeh or lentils or seitan or whatever on a regular basis, then that extra, 8 grams per cup or 9 grams per cup of protein from like soy milk might be important. But
Mhm.
obviously, if you're meeting your needs otherwise, then go nuts with oat or almond or whatever. Doesn't matter to me. But it's just something to think about. Oh, and
Mm.
yeah, someone mentioned the ripple milk. Yeah, the pea milk, the ripple milk is generally very high in protein.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so there's a lot of, people that are talking about, well, the plant-based industry doesn't need to have ag-gag laws in place, things like that, so lots of conversation about, we've been talking about health and we've mentioned environment as well. And so Nisha and Jeremy were saying, I wonder how, I would like to know how Dr. Nagra incorporates the ethical aspect of the discussion, and is the health conversation yeah, just do you ever bring that in, or do you try to stick to the health conversation? I mean, I guess obviously as somebody in the health industry, it's a little bit, yeah, little hard to navigate, I imagine.
Yeah, it depends on the case. So I am vegan. Like
Mhm.
I volunteer or at least I've kind of stopped now due to being busy. But for 3, 4 years up until recently, I volunteered in an animal sanctuary. Like I do all of that. But when it comes to the health claims that are made, because that's what I tackle the most, I focus on the health. And that's just because I find that a lot of, for one, I want to tackle the claim head on, but I also find that a lot of people who aren't in the vegan space, they will end up just disregarding what you have to say about the health as soon as you bring up things like ethics or environment. Now, I have on my social media, I have posts that are centered specifically on the ethics. I have posts that are centered specifically on the environment, but like 90% of my content is centered on nutrition. So I try to speak about each of them, but obviously I tailor to the nutrition conversation because
Mhm.
that's what I think I'm best at doing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, Reese is asking, what research concerning plant-based meats is lacking? If you had the funding, all the funding you wanted in the world, Matthew, what study would you construct?
We
Love the
talk about
question.
this in our review. We actually finished with what we want to see in the future. So there's a few things. Um, I would like to see trials on gluten-based products, so like seitan products, because that's super lacking. Now, I suspect that they'll be fine. I don't see any issue with them, but I'm actually curious, are there some unique benefits to those products. Because like soy protein, we know there are some unique cholesterol lowering benefits. And I'd like to see, is there something else there with the gluten-based products? Now, what I also think we really need is long-term data looking at actual like heart attacks and strokes. So rather than these markers, following people for periods of years, decades even if we can, and looking at those outcomes. Now, we do have some research that has come out more recently suggesting that plant-based meats, at least when combined with plant-based milks, may lower risk of type 2 diabetes. We have a little bit of research on, I believe it was pancreatic cancer and a lower risk. We have some research on improved bone health with plant-based meat consumption. That might be due to the protein, because protein may lower risk of fracture or improve bone mineral density with age. Um, but we just don't have a lot around heart health specifically when it comes to long term. We can speculate that they'd be good for us because of this data that we have in the shorter term trials, but that's something I'd really like to see.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so anybody have some funding for that? You game, Matthew?
Yeah. Well, I've been in. Funny enough, when our review came out, I started chatting with a lot of researchers about like projects that we can work on and stuff. So I think at some point, well, just a lot of people are very busy right now. So, but at some point, I think we will get something.
Yeah. So any of you that are scientists out there, just heed the call that we need more people doing research. We need more studies. So, okay. Leanne is, oh, sorry. No, let me see. Michelle is asking, what about the non-heme iron debate on bioavailability? This is one that comes up a lot.
Yeah, so heme iron is generally more bioavailable. So heme iron is the type that you can get from red meat. Red meats actually contain both types, but they have the heme iron, and then plants do not contain heme iron, at least not naturally. The Impossible Burger actually has some like heme in there, which they extract from like soy, and like they do a bunch of stuff to it. But so heme is more bioavailable. It's more consistently bioavailable. So you absorb, I can't recall the exact number, around 25-ish%, 20, 25, 30%, somewhere in that range. Whereas with the non-heme iron, which is what you can get from more plant-based products, there's a huge range and it's generally lower on average. Now, there are certain things you can do to boost absorption, things like vitamin C. So consuming iron-rich foods or iron supplements with vitamin C, whether that's from fruits or from a vitamin C tablet, that can boost absorption. But at the same time, plant foods actually contain significantly more iron on average than animal-based products. So yes, meat contains the more bioavailable heme iron, but plant foods generally contain more iron overall. So even if you're absorbing less, it might end up kind of evening out. And that might be one reason why we don't see higher rates of iron deficiency in vegan and vegetarian populations. At least in Western populations, the rates of deficiency are quite similar, regardless of diet. It's just very common amongst women of reproductive age, and that's because of menstrual cycle and losing iron on a monthly basis. So I think it's something to consider regardless, but I wouldn't chalk it up necessarily to diet alone. Obviously, if someone's low and they're consistently low, then talk to your doctor about a high dose supplement or something like that. But that's going to be more effective than relying on meat in the vast majority of cases.
Here's another argument, Matthew, that has been coming up even more so in the last couple of years. Surprise, surprise. And that's kind of almost the cultural war on plant-based, this idea of like, oh, we're traditional men and we need to eat, the true food, the real food. And so, yeah, if that argument comes up at this, the so-called barbecue that we're talking at, what would be some easy responses to that? This idea that, we stay close to the land and it's healthier and all that sort of thing.
Well, as far as the health, I think we've tackled that. But as far as like it's for masculinity or whatever that happens to be, I'm like there's different ways to respond. There's sort of the quippy response, and then there's the more like serious response.
Give us both.
Quippy, yeah, the quippy one is usually more so like, is your sense of masculinity so fragile that you have to eat meat 3 times a day to sort of maintain it? So that's like the kind of funnier version. But like really, what does that even mean? Like, you could point to people like, if they're talking about say muscle and strength or whatever, you can point to people like Nimai Delgado, Brian Turner, like a lot of these professional kind of bodybuilders or fitness influencers in the plant-based space, and like I can almost guarantee that they're a lot bigger and muscular than whoever you're talking to, and 99.9% of cases that'll be it. So like, what is the point now? And someone mentioned erectile dysfunction in the chat. That's funny. Yeah. So actually, that could be an early sign of cardiovascular disease, and there's actually a study coming out soon, I believe, looking at erectile function and plant-based products versus animal-based products. So, yeah. So, anyways, it depends on the person and like
Yeah.
what kind of response you want to have. And we have research comparing plant-based protein, animal protein, and you get similar muscle and strength gains. So, um, yeah, I don't know. You can run with that in whatever direction you want.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. Um, uh, Priest is asking, are we saying that there's no validity concerns over long list ingredients?
Yeah, I would say there's zero. It depends on what they are. Like just because something has a long list of ingredients does not mean that it's problematic. Like you can go into Whole Foods and get one of those like smoothies, the pre-made smoothies or whatever that they have in the bottles, and there's probably like 15 ingredients, or there can be depending on which one. And
Mhm.
or I mean, you can make a salad with 20 ingredients if you wanted to. And when you consider like herbs and spices and stuff, like you can just look at even the Beyond Meat, like the latest iteration of the Beyond Meat product. Yeah, sure, there's like 8, 9, whatever ingredients on there, but it's like the protein, the avocado oil, and spices for the most part,
Mhm.
so you have to look at like what is the net effect of that food on your health. You can't just boil it down to a number of ingredients. Beef might just be beef, but it's not good for you. It's one ingredient. Does that mean it's healthy? No. So
Mhm.
I would not focus on number of ingredients at all.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Um, there is some question about the seed oils in plant-based meats. Some talk about seed oils being very bad for inflammation. Can you verify or give us a little
Yeah,
more information on that?
that's completely false.
Okay.
So it's the one thing that every diet camp seems to agree on, whether you're whole foods plant-based, whether you're keto, carnivore, whatever, they all think that seed oils are damaging. And honestly, they're all wrong based on the best available evidence. When you
Mhm.
look at the research, we have long-term randomized controlled trials, like some of the best in the case of the LA Veterans Administration hospital study, like some of the best research ever done in the nutrition field, I would say, as far as clinical trials go, showing that they improve cardiovascular risk and not just your cholesterol, like actual risk of heart attack and so on. And when you look at these claims around inflammation, they're speculative. So what people will say is that, okay, in theory, vegetable oils contain or seed oils contain this type of fat called linoleic acid, a fair amount of it. In theory, that could be converted into arachidonic acid. And in theory, that arachidonic acid is inflammatory. And so they connect all these dots and say that therefore vegetable oils are inflammatory. But we have a number of studies where you actually feed these oils to humans and you measure markers of inflammation, and not a single study has ever shown an increase in inflammation. So let that set in. There's literally not a, and it's not like it hasn't been tested. It's been tested a lot. Not a single
Mhm.
study has ever shown that. Um,
Mhm.
it, at worst, they've shown neutral, or no, let me put it this way. At worst, they've shown that they lower inflammation less than other oils, but none of them have shown that they raise inflammation. So yeah, so it's complete nonsense. And we also have actually a very recent study and others prior to it where they measure the levels of linoleic acid in your tissues. So the linoleic acid in your fat tissue or other components of your body. And those with higher levels have lower risks of cardiovascular disease or mortality, premature death. And it's only there because you ate it. We do not make that fat. So it's a really good marker of like, are you consuming more or less?
You're on fire. I can tell. This is one that you're like, we got to
Yeah.
get rid of this myth. You're like the myth buster superhero, health myth buster. Okay, I've just got two more quick questions for you. Carrie is asking what response do we give when someone asks us based on what evidence? What would you say is the best place to send people or to refer to?
So there's a few. So actually, for one, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics just released their new position paper on plant-based diets. This one was focused on adults. They're going to release separate ones for different populations. But literally like 2 days ago or something, it just came out. That's a really good resource. I think they did an excellent job with it. If you're looking for evidence on just the kind of general health benefits of a plant-based diet for at least adults. Now, in that position paper, at the end, they link resources for people, and there's two of them that I really like. One is veganhealth.org, and one was veganrd, I think, .com. I don't know if it was .com or something else, but I think it was .com. Um, those two were those two are some of the best, most comprehensive resources out there, in my opinion, with very accurate information. So you won't be misled by, some people in the plant-based space maybe exaggerating things or whatever. I think those are some of the best resources. And someone's asking for the link. I'm gonna see if I can just pull it up really quick.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I
Please
think I
do.
have it here. Oh yeah, so 6 days ago. I was off by a few days. Um, I don't know if it's open. Oh, it is open access. Cool. So you'll be able to,
Great.
I'll put it in there in a second. And then if you scroll
Thank you
all
so
the way
much.
down to the bottom of it, you'll get uh, the links to those other resources I mentioned.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, people are hungry for this link. Um,
There you go. I just posted it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And just on that topic of, I think we do have some newbies to kind of plant-based eating, Matthew. So Matt asked, aside from comparing meat analogs to meat, some studies also compared beans, tofu, tempeh, etc., to meat. And from a health perspective, those blow meat out of the water, do they?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there's what are called there's a couple different types of studies that are done. There's the trials, again, like the shorter term studies, randomized trials where you look at markers. And you generally see improvements in like LDL cholesterol level, sometimes blood pressure, sometimes blood glucose management. But one thing that happens with a lot of these trials is they use like extra lean cuts of meat. And so those are going to be, the difference isn't going to be as stark. So that's something to look out for. But even so, the plant-based products tend to come out on top, at least for like things like beans. Just not to as large of a degree as you might with more typical products.
Right.
Um, but then when you look at the long-term outcomes, let's say studies, some like the Nurses Health Study and health professionals follow-up that lasted, now it's almost 4 decades, um, or the NIH AARP study, which is shorter term but still several years. When you look at those and you look at the substitution of red meat for plant protein sources, you see significant reductions in mortality and cardiovascular disease and other outcomes. And usually with a pretty small swap. So, like in the NIH AARP study, there were significant benefits to swapping out just 3% of calories from red meat protein for plant protein. So, to put that in perspective, that's like if you ate a 2,000 calorie diet, we'll say a typical diet, and you swap out just literally like a deck of cards worth of red meat, of like beef or something, for plant protein sources, that was enough to lead to significant improvements in risk. And I can't recall the exact numbers for the outcomes, but it was in the ballpark of like a 10 to 15% reduction in the risk of dying from certain causes. Like a pretty meaningful for such a tiny little swap.
And I think important to note, the biggest sort of spectrum is with red meat, but
Yeah.
it's chicken, fish. They've all got their problems health wise.
So with the chicken, we definitely see similar depending on what you're swapping it with. So again, if you're swapping with plant protein sources, you'll generally see more improvements with the plant protein. With fish, it's actually more neutral. So it tends to
Mm.
be more neutral. With certain studies, particularly in populations where they eat a ton of fish, there might be some benefit to swapping a bit of it for the plant protein. But fish is like one of the exceptions where I would say the reasons to limit or eliminate fish are more to do with the ethical or environmental considerations over necessarily the health considerations.
Got it. Thank you so much. Okay, well, last thing, Matthew, we've got a whole crew of people who love to take action. Is there anything that you would love to see people do on this issue of misinformation around plant-based meat? Is there anything you'd like people to do with your review? Give us something to do.
I mean, I think honestly, it's just we need to share a lot of this information around. So whether it's my review or other reputable sources, like I think Nutrition Made Simple on YouTube is great. Simon Hill is excellent. A lot of the people who are doing the work of like dispelling myths or misinformation in the space, I think just promoting their message, and that ultimately helps with like the algorithm and getting it out there to more people. Because I think what a lot of the sort of anti-plant-based community has done well is they've created this ecosystem where like their stuff often just takes off like wildfire. It's absolutely crazy. And so we need to combat that by doing similar and just getting the message out there.
Amazing. Thank you. And we're going to put a great Men's Health article about the review that Matthew led. And once again, we're going to put that, Ina, in the chat. And yes, and please follow Dr. Nagra on his socials. He's very active. He's got amazing videos that are just so shareable. Thank you for that service to the movement, Matthew. And so really get out there and do some sharing of this man's work. Thank you, Dr. Nagra, for coming. Let's go back to our gallery view, Ina. And if you wouldn't mind, folks, can we open the mic up, Ina, and can we let people say a big thank you to Dr. Nagra for your work and for being here today? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
very
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so good,
Great.
Matthew. You're like I said, you're just you got it all. You're our superhero. And so folks, thank you very much for coming. We will see you at the next Lunchtime Live. Make sure that you are part of our community to get notice of what our next topic is. Matthew, have a great day. Have a great day, everybody, and we will see you soon. Bye.